Welcome to Lift Your Legacy. My name is Jacob Rupp, father, husband, and rabbi. And each week we bring you an inspiring person or message to help you unlock your inner potential and create change that will impact the future. Thank you for listening, and let's get to it.
It's so exciting to jump on with someone that's really changed your life for the better. Anyone that knows me knows that I read a lot. And, my wife makes fun of me because my barrier for like great presentations or great ideas is extremely high. So you could have someone that's, it's a good message, but I'm like, yeah, not so good. I heard it. So when I find books or I find concepts that stand out, it really means a lot. At least in my book, there's something really unique. There's a new angle. There's something deeper that's over there. And one example of one of the standout classics that I will refer to my clients, that I'll refer to my friends, to people that I care about, is the book called The Go-Giver by Bob Burg and John David Mann. And it's about 10 years old, and it has really fundamentally blown up in a lot of ways and has changed people's lives. It's become really a system, and it's great. I loved it. It's short. It's done in a story form. So the message really comes in. And I had the tremendous opportunity to speak to the author, Bob Burg, who not only is he a renowned speaker and business mind and a student of the greats, the Tom Hopkins and Zig Ziglars, but also someone who's deeply rooted in Jewish thought. And as of course, my listeners will know, nothing really fires me up more where you're able to take a concept that's in the Torah, that's in, our vast resources of material, and be able to plug it in, not only just to so it's life, it becomes life. And you're like, wow, that's that same concept. So this was a thrilling conversation for me. We go through all kinds of deep ideas about how to find what you want to do, how to have a greater impact on people, how to build a life and a business that you're proud of. And it's really my pleasure to have on the Go-Giver author, Bob Burg. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this podcast has been brought to you by me, Jacob Rupp, and Jacob Rupp's Consulting, technically Lift Your Legacy. Now, I have to be honest, I help clients often get out of their own way. And something that has really held me up was exactly the same thing, that I was in my own way. For months, people have been saying, talk about your coaching, talk about how you help people, share it, etc. And I had a really hard time putting it out there. Why? Because it's not that I don't think I do a great job. I've seen amazing results from my clients, 10x, even more than that, businesses, fixed relationships, helped people lose a lot of weight. People go on the path of making goals and fulfilling their goals, all of these things. I know I do it. And I've been in the coaching space long enough to know that there's a lot of people that don't really deliver. And the ones that do really deliver are worth literally their weight in gold, because so often we're held back by stuff. And it's just like, if only I could get over that, if only I could work through that. And I help people do that. But for me, my big holdup was sharing that I do this in a big way, in a public way, especially on the podcast, because it's awkward. I don't want people to think, oh, I'm just making the podcast to sell you stuff or to talk about stuff. So that's not what I'm doing. My point is like this. My coaching business is expanding. I'm taking on a few more clients. If you are someone that is struggling in the area of self-esteem, goal setting, health, relationships, or your business, really, reach out. I don't know if we're a good fit to work with each other. What I can guarantee you is that we'll get on the phone for half an hour. I'll hear the kind of challenges you're having. You'll get a good feel, if you don't know me yet, of the kind of work I do, kind of program I would recommend for you. And if it's a great fit, we'll move forward. And if not, not. But I wanted to appreciate very much from the bottom of my heart the fact that you guys all listen. I appreciate the amazing guests that I have. And I'm really thrilled to have broken through in my own life to the point where I could actually devote a segment to really make a somewhat long-winded, but I think very important advertisement. So if you want to reach out to me, the email is rabbi, R-A-B-B-I, rupp at gmail.com. And the website is liftyourlegacy.live, and at lift_your_legacy on Instagram. I think it's pretty simple. You know where to find me because you found the podcast. Thank you so much. Bob Burg, I am so excited. I just got back your book so that I had been loading it out like crazy, and I wanted to have it here to show that this was one of the fundamental books. And it's not just me. Obviously, you got Daniel Pink and Marlee Forleo and Dave Ramsey and all these people. You wrote a book, and it really created a mindset and an approach to life and to business that has been truly fundamental. But before we get to that, I would love to go back a little bit and hear a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Okay, well, I began as a broadcaster, actually, first in radio and then in television. I was actually the late night news guy for a very, very small ABC in the United States. Really, it wasn't that I graduated into sales. And I floundered really for the first few months because I knew nothing about sales. I had no formal sales training, and the company where I was working, we'll just say their training was negligible at best. And so I was kind of just out there on my own. And fortunately, after a few months, I kind of stumbled into a bookstore and picked up a couple of books. One was by Tom Hopkins, one was by Zig Ziglar. This is almost 40 years ago now. And when I got the book, I just, I studied it and I read it and I highlighted and underlined and practiced and really within a few weeks, my sales began to really take off. So this was very encouraging to me because it said, if you have a system for doing things, a methodology, you can accomplish what you need to accomplish. To this day, I would personally define a system as simply the process of predictably achieving a goal based on a logical and specific set of how-to principles, the key being predictability, right? If it's
okay, just 1 second. I want to jump back very quickly for the listeners that might not have picked up something that's very important. You were working in broadcast journalism. You graduated, you said very nicely, into sales. Most it's a good way of looking at it. And you found yourself to be floundering. You weren't very good. So a lot of times people will find themselves in situations, and like, were you married at this point? Did you have family, anything like that? What was your personal? No. Okay. So you're by yourself, you're trying to make a living, and you find that you're not very good at the way that you're trying to put money in the account. And it's a business that is dependent on you being good at what you do. Yes. And so what did you do? A lot of people might, start blaming, start associating, start running away. You went into a bookstore. So you sought to actually educate yourself. You started to realize that this is a learnable skill. So many people think speaking and writing and sales, they're all just intrinsic. And it's like, well, maybe for some, but a lot of people just train themselves. And the second point is that you were able to see incremental changes. That's the important thing. I think a lot of times to be again, you're thinking of, the all-time all-stars, you see a Tom Hopkins or a Zig Ziglar, and you're like, oh man, forget about it. That's not me. But it's not about becoming them. It's about making incremental small changes. So you're actually not that far from a breakthrough that you might think. So those were two things that just popped out right away. But let's jump back into it. So you build a system. You want to see a system in your sales, in your life, in your business. So what's the next step for you?
Yeah, well, and I think the points you brought up are very important. There are few natural anythings. Now, we are typically born with an inclination for certain things. Okay, there's the person who is born with great gross motor and small motor control, and they can go up there and swing a bat and hit a ball. But if they have an aptitude for it, an inclination, but if they don't practice and put on a whole lot of hours doing it, they're never going to improve. They're never going to get to the point where they can play pro ball. Someone else may have a natural inclination for something else or for something else, and that's great. But to master something, it takes a lot of work and a lot of practice. Now, fortunately, the way that Hashem has created the world tends to be that those things that we're good at, we also like. Not always, but it tends to be that way.
I can't oversimplify this point that you're making, or overlook this point, because I think it's so fundamental. Because if you look in the world, and certainly with the influencer culture, which you are an expert in, which we'll speak about in a little bit, you see that there's sort of like one way. Maybe in the 80s it was like on Wall Street, or maybe the early 2000s it was in real estate. Like, it seems like there's certainly for Jews it was like being a doctor or a lawyer, and it seems like there's one way of making it. And if you want to do something else that maybe it doesn't fit in with the one way of making it, if you're not a numbers guy, so to speak, or you have no interest in sales, you feel like, well, I guess I just have to relegate myself to being second best. But what you're saying is that there is no shame in dialing into what you're naturally good at, what you naturally appeal to, but that doesn't mean you have to be world class right away. It just means that's your first step, correct?
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. And hey, there's no question that even those things we may not have an aptitude for, we can learn it to a certain point. We probably will never be as good as the person who started at a certain level, and then because it was kind of, and I always hate to say natural. I want to say they have an inclination toward, and then who also worked at it. So that's why, in fact, let's go back to something that's often said. Okay, and this is a saying that while it's not untrue, it's not complete. Okay, and the saying is, follow your passion and you'll never work another day in your life. Okay, again, it's good in terms of course, why not follow your passion? What you're passionate about is probably also what you're naturally inclined to do, but it can't stop there. We also have to be able to create or have a marketplace for that we're able to serve and that people are willing to buy. Otherwise, we just have a hobby, right? And hobbies are great. I recommend them, but it's probably not something that you're going to make a living out of. So I think it's always great to, when you love to do something, well, pursue it, of course. Now, by the way, remember too, you might be that person who's not a great athlete by nature, and you love athletics. So what can you do? Well, maybe you're going to be the person who writes that newsletter, or you're going to be in management, or you're going to be the greatest general manager who ever lived, or do something in terms of, so there's usually ways to take what we want to do and what we feel an inclination to and turn it into a living, which is, when you can do it, when you can do what you love and have a good income coming in, oh my gosh, I mean, that's a great way to live life.
So that's such an important point that you're making, is that a lot of times when we throw around this word passion, what sort of pops up in our mind are the artists and the writers and my passion is exercise, my passion is jujitsu, all of this stuff that you're like, yeah, but how are you going to make a living? But the fascinating thing is, speaking to someone like yourself, speaking just like the opportunities that's around in the world today, is it's not like you can't make money doing what you like. It's just that you have to figure out how do you crystallize a system. And
right.
Here you're, and I want to hear it from your words, but you start with a book, but really it's not the book, it's a concept, it's a mechanism, it's a system. And the book becomes classes, it becomes a program, it becomes multiple different, niche specific presentations. So it's like, you should never think, well, my passion is too loose or esoteric for me to monetize. It's just, I have this passion. I just have to figure out how do I put it in a format, in a vehicle that other people can get behind and ultimately compensate me for.
Yeah, well, exactly, because we need to have a market for it, and there is a market for it. You just have to figure out what it is, and that's and that's a key, of course. So sure, I totally agree with that.
So, okay, so you're getting better at sales. You've learned from the masters. I think it must just be so cool, not to spin out to the very end of the story, but for you to have now a book that's one of those, all-time sales classics. When you started off, kind of the trenches with the Tom Hopkins and Zig Ziglar's. But so tell me a little bit about it. So your sales career starts to take off. Then what happens?
There's one thing that happened in between before I even went into speaking. that really turned things around with me, because I learned from, again, Tom Hopkins and Zig Ziglar and all the great books that I read, all the great, what I would call the classics, the How to Win Friends and Influence People, the Think and Grow Rich, the Magic of Thinking Big, and all the great books that everybody in sales at the time, read. And it helped grow me on the inside and so forth. My sales career was going well, but I was definitely not fulfilling my potential in that regard. There was something holding me back, and what was holding me back was me, and it was my focus. I thought of sales, and this is not the fault of Tom Hopkins and Zig Ziglar, this is just where I was at the time, was I was looking at sales. I was so into sales that, and while I had a great product I was selling and I cared about my customers, it was still about the sale. And what happened was I came back to the office. I was selling a high-ticket item for a certain company, and I came back to the office one day, and I was really discouraged because the sale did not take place, and I knew it was my fault because the product or service was great for that person, and obviously if I had done my job correctly, I would have been able to serve that person, and that great, but it didn't happen. And one of the older guys who was there, he wasn't in the sales department. I think he was in the engineering department, but he was an older guy who didn't say much, but he was one of those, when he did say something, it always made sense. It was always profound, right? And he said to me, Berg, can I give you some advice? And I said, yeah, sure, please do. And he said, if you want to make a lot of money in sales, he said, don't have making money as your target. Your target, he said, is serving others. Now, when you hit the target, you'll get a reward, and that reward will come in the form of money, and you can do with that money whatever you choose. But never forget, he said, the money is simply the reward for hitting the target. It's not the target itself. Your target is serving others. Well, that was my moment, because it was then that, what do they call it? An epiphany, right? Where I realized that selling is not, great salesmanship is never about the salesperson. Okay. It's great selling is not even about the product or service, as important as that product or service is. Great salesmanship is about understanding that it's about the other person and how they are going to benefit, how their life is going to be made better through your product or service.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to point out that I'm sure it's could be that what's interesting is I'm sure if you delved into any of those, we call the fundamentals of the sales books, you'd probably find that there. You probably find that concept there. But what's interesting is it didn't hit you, which means you could be staring all the time at the right answers and you don't see it. But the interesting thing is, and I'm just speaking this out, and I'm curious, so there's a concept that when I guess if you're so busy looking at the trees, you can't see the forest. A lot of times you have to be able to detach and to look back. And so many people live their lives in this cycle of desperation. I'm saying, like, it's very easy when everyone thinks this, it's like, it's very easy to look at the very highly compensated salesperson and say, well, you're not doing it for the money, but I got, the mortgage, the rent, the kids, like, I need the money. So how did you, and I have like just a Jewish rabbinic answer, perhaps that's where faith kicks in, but how did you, or what was the steps that went into hearing that lesson and truly internalizing it? And were you really at a time where money didn't matter, or was it like money did matter, but I just have to have that faith that this is going to be my next step?
So I don't think it's a matter of money not mattering. And when you say don't focus on the money, don't have making money as your target, that doesn't mean it's not important. And it doesn't mean the end goal isn't to make money. It's that if you focus on the money, what's going to happen is you're not focused on the other person, and they're going to be able to sense that. Okay. So, one thing I often say when I speak at a sales conference is I'll say that, everyone in the audience is a salesperson. So I know I'm, speaking with a group of people who are all of the same mindset, right? And I'll say, nobody's going to buy from you because you have a quota to meet. And we all laugh because as salespeople, we all know that's true. They're not going to buy from us because we have a quota to meet. I'll say they're not going to buy from you because you need the money. And they're not even going to buy from you because you are a really nice person. They're going to buy from you only because ultimately they believe they will be better off by doing so than by not doing so. So the best thing that you can do as a salesperson, best thing any salesperson can do if they really want to make money, is to not focus on the money. That's one of those paradoxes of life, okay? If you want to make a lot of money, don't focus on the money. Focus on the value that you are providing another human being, because that's the only reason they're going to do business with you. It's why we say that money is simply an echo of value, okay? Money is an echo of value. It's the thunder to value's lightning, which means nothing more than that the value must come first. That must be where your focus is. The value comes first. The money you receive is a very natural result of the value you've provided.
So it's such a fascinating concept. One of the things that really like lights my fire is when you find, you know, these truisms in business or in commerce and or really in anything, psychology, and then you can able to look back and see that that's a very fundamental principle, not just for that specific industry or that specific, you know, sales, you know, that whatever you want to call that a topic, but it's very like at the fundamentals of all of human relationships.
Sure.
Which is, you know, that concept of, I mean, even in the Torah, where it talks about, you know, loving your neighbor as yourself. It's not about, you know, do what you want for the other person. It's like, you know, like you're up at night and your kid's screaming at you. Maybe this is just evident, you know, this is just my life a little bit, you know, but like you want silence, but you can't yell at your kid, I want silence. You have to figure out it's actually going to be better for the kid if they get the amount of sleep they need, if they X, Y, and Z, because no one at the end of the day, your agenda is your problem, but you have to focus on what's good for other people, not just in business, not just for people that are out there selling, but really in anything. It's if your focus is on the other, so then ultimately you will get your needs met at a much faster rate.
Yeah, Dale Carnegie in his classic How to Win Friends and Influence People said, and I think this is the underlying premise of his entire book, and it's where he wrote, ultimately, people do things for their reasons, not our reasons. So as leaders, as influencers, what we need to do is find out, we need to discover that other person's reason. And generally, we can do that you know, only through asking questions and then really, really listening. You know, listening not to speak, listening to truly understand and get what this person is about. Get, you know, what is, you know, selling is simply discovering what the other person needs, wants, and desires and helping them to get it. So is leadership. So is relationships. So is pretty much anything.
Right. It's a famous line from the Ethics of the Fathers where it says, you know, you have to make God's will your will, then God will do your will. So it's like, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, what's my responsibility, it's absolutely fundamental that, you know, if you look at what am I obligated, you know, to do for the other person, to what are the responsibilities, the needs the other person has, that always is going to trump what's owed to me. You won't find a successful person that's like that. So how did you go from beyond the sales component and feeling like you were held back and seeing this light to creating your own system, which is tremendous. Again, I'm calling the Go Giver a system because it's a lot more than just a book, clearly.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I mean it.
Well, I eventually worked my way up to sales manager of that company, and I started doing things that you know, again, were kind of people were taking notice of, and I had the feeling I could probably start to show others what was working for me. Again, it wasn't necessarily anything I made up. I mean, it was everything I had learned. What does Pirkei Avot say? You know, who is wise? That person who learns from all others. And so I think when we can do that, you know, we're on the right track. And I loved teaching and sharing and being able to, you know, to do those things. So one day I went to a seminar because I was always going to sales seminars and learning. And I bought the person. This is many years ago. I bought that person's cassette tape program. That's how long ago this was.
Nice.
Cassette tape program. And in the back, he said something like, if you want to learn how to sell these tapes, and learn how to speak, call our office. And so I did, and I went down there and they showed me how to speak at all these groups, for free. And I could speak for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and I'd sell the tapes at the back. And I got pretty good at them. Again, I just followed a system for doing so. And, but eventually I wanted to go off on my own and teach things that were working for me, that I could kind of put together the things I had learned. I was very blessed to have great parents. And, my dad is probably, and he's 95 right now. And the best person I have ever seen in terms of people skills. Really? And to him, it was about as natural as it could be. He did have a very natural way of relating to people. He truly loved people and was interested in people. To me, that didn't come naturally to me, but I'm glad I got to watch the master at work, and it was just wonderful. And so, I always say the single greatest people skill is a highly developed and authentic interest in the other person. And while Dad never said that to me, it's what I observed all the time and watching him. He always just genuinely cared. He always wanted to make other people feel genuinely good about themselves. And so I wanted to kind of bring that into my teaching as well. And again, when I say my teaching, I'm just carrying on my dad's, legacy. And so that became a big part of my work as well. So it was kind of combining the sales and the people skills and and so forth. And that's, and it's evolved over the years. And, so that part's been a lot of fun.
When's the book? Because the interesting thing is that, and I think this is such a fundamental lesson also, is there is such a pressure amongst, I do a little bit of work with college students. I know people do a lot of work with college students. Across the board, there's anxiety, there's depression, there's frustration. Like, what are you talking about? Like, why should you be so, again, I'm not minimizing it, but, at a time when people you would think would have so much freedom and opportunity in front of them, there's this like tremendous pressure to like narrow down and figure it out. And the fascinating thing that I'm hearing from you is that at no stage was this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this wasn't like, I want to write a book down the road. Like you were a broadcaster, you were a sales guy, you like speaking, you found, that you slowly incorporate more lessons. So like, it sounds like there was an evolution. Oh, yeah. And you were aware of it, but it wasn't like out the gate, this is what you want to do from the time you're 5 years old.
No, I wanted to be third baseman for the Boston Red Sox.
See, everyone's got different plans.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't have that skill set that would allow me to go that far with it. But yeah, I also, though, had an interest in radio and in broadcasting. I was kind of that annoying kid who, while I was playing, was also announcing the game. Uh-huh. So there was something there. But I did enjoy, once I found sales, I enjoyed the personal development aspect of it a lot. Mm-hmm. And when I got into the teaching of it, which was really speaking, is what you're doing when you're up there, and when I enjoyed that. When I wrote the first book, which was called Endless Referrals, Network Your Everyday Contacts into Sales, I really wrote that first book for utilitarian purposes. A few friends at the National Speakers Association at one of the conventions said, you've got to really write a book, get yourself positioned. It's going to make it easier to market yourself and so forth and so on. And they were right. It was really good. But as I evolved and my career evolved, I started writing because I felt I had something I wanted to share. So I guess when you say evolvement, yeah, that happened. But it's funny, as that happened, and I was very, very fortunate to know John David Mann, who's my co-author of the entire Go-Giver series, and he's the lead storyteller. He's the guy who makes the story really come alive. And so, but since that point, it took my career on a whole new, trajectory. And so, you do things because, again, you kind of get a calling for it, and you just, that's what you want to do. I mean, when you think about it, life is a pursuit of happiness, if you will. I mean, right? It's baked right into our Declaration of Independence, right? Seeking happiness.
I'm curious. There's two things there, because that I would love to break down and just sort of illustrate that. It seems is that one thing you said is that there's, a certain level of, there's a perception out there that I have to achieve I have to be Derek Jeter before I write a book about baseball, right? That, sorry for the Yankees analogy. I realized that was insensitive.
Did you say Derek Jeter?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh, I didn't hear that. Yeah, well, he's now the owner of the Miami Marlins, who,
Okay, all right, great. I'm saying, like,
So, yeah.
we have a sense that we have to be so unbelievably successful at something before we start offering advice to other people. And what's really interesting to me is to hear you say you had a little bit of success, but you weren't the number one salesman in the entire country, but you just wanted to help other people. So how did you get that courage to, sort of tell yourself, I have advice that would benefit other people. I should get out and share my story? Because for a lot of people, that's hard to do because we're such works in progress as it is.
Well, I mean, so there's 2 points there. When I started speaking on sales, yeah, I had achieved some good success. So I did feel qualified to do that. But I think you can, as you start to grow at anything, teaching as you're coming along with it is also a great, way to get good at it. I wouldn't suggest teaching something you know nothing about, but when you're learning something, and here and someone else is here, you can teach, and but you're also learning and you're growing more, and there's other people who are as well, and we're all sharing knowledge with one another. So I think someone, if they're going to get on stage, if they're going to write a book, they should be qualified to know what they're talking about. But I don't think you have to wait until that point to start sharing information and teaching with others by any means. It's it's sort of when you get together with a Torah scholar, right? And you don't say he's teaching me. You always say I'm learning with him. And I always notice the rabbis always say we're learning together, even though the rabbi has more knowledge in their little finger than I have in my entire body. They say learning, and we say learning. So that's just to me it's a really great frame. Because again, we're all always learning.
So it's a little bit of courage and a little bit of humility. I love that.
It's that slip of paper, right, on the two sides with the world was created for me, and I am but dust. It's all right, and wisdom is knowing when is appropriate.
Okay, so you are, and it's funny. Before I appreciated and understood your Jewish background, and I was reading your book, I was like, oh, hey, a lot of this is Torah. Tell me a little bit about how Judaism, how religion in general, like your personal journey, and if those teachings shaped what you're doing now or what you put in your work.
So it's funny. My dad, who I referred to earlier, always taught me from the time I was a little kid. He would always ask me these 5 questions, okay, that I was supposed to know the answer to. 4 were from Simeon Ben Zoma of Predicate Avot, and it was, who is rich, who is wise, who is mighty, and who is honored. And then Dad also had a 5th one that he'd ask, who is brave? And the answer is that person who is smart enough to be afraid and still do their job. But so Dad would constantly ask me those questions. Those were the ones I was always supposed to know. And it's always such a great memory for me that, when he'd ask me the question and I'd get it right and so forth. Dad also would tell me, and by the way, I talk about my dad. My mom is also a wonderful mom, and I'm blessed to have both of them. But as a boy relates to his father and a daughter relates to their mother, it's a bit different. If my sister Robin's telling this, she's talking about mom, is a bit right. So my dad would also tell me that everything God does is for a reason, which it sounds trite and cliche, but it helped get me through, the tsaurus I had as a kid, as like every kid does, right? But, and so I always grew up believing that. That to me, no matter how bad things got, I also, on another topic, not to go down another thread, but I have had since I was a kid, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, which has been a big struggle and journey in itself. But that aside, that's one reason why there's been a lot of, issues. But I would always continue to come back to the fact that Dad said everything God does is for a reason. Okay. We may not know what it is, and we often don't. And sometimes we'll find it out, and other times we may not. but everything has a reason. And, I would say that kept me sane, right? It also helped me go through life and be able to, to be able to do that. While my parents weren't Orthodox, they both grew up that I would guess I think everybody was pretty much Orthodox when they were growing up in that term, not everybody, but it was more, no, they certainly weren't. Although Dad, we would have said conservative Jews, but Dad went to Minyan every morning, used to get up early, go to Minyan, and he was kind of the guy who mentored the other ones, the younger ones who went to Minyan, and Dad showed them what to do. And he did his davening every morning, afternoon, every evening. So very, faith-filled. And that's just kind of what I lived because that's what I saw. So, yeah, I mean, I think that and, while I don't consider myself particularly observant, although I did for a while, I'd say about 6 or 7 years when I was very involved in Aish Torah, I did more along those lines. And while I did not feel the need to continue that in the way that I had, it's helped so much in terms of my learning and in terms of my living. And I'll just say that people like Rabbi Pliskin's, Rabbi Zelig Pliskin of Aish Torah, and Reb Noach, just their writings, their works, and many of the other Rabbi Kalman Packhouse, who has this fax he sends out right. I've been on that. My brother-in-law put me on that about 20 years ago. And I'll just tell you, this is how the seeds of how things happen, okay? About 20, probably maybe 25 years ago, I get this fax and from Rabbi Packhouse at Aish, Miami. And it's a nice little fax where it has the, a lesson, and it has okay, so my brother-in-law put me on that list. I didn't even know. So I get that, and some of what I'm reading is really kind of hitting me. There was a Growth Through Torah section with Rabbi Pliskin, and I started reading, and one of my issues was I gossiped a lot, and I don't know why it was never allowed in my house, but I must have gotten a recessive gossip gene because I used to do it all the time. And I read something that Rabbi Pliskin talked about, and he mentioned the Chafetz Chaim, and so I bought a book, Guard Your Tongue, by Rabbi Pliskin, and that really started me on a whole track to self-improvement, appreciation, and all the different things. And from there, I have on my bookshelf, in my bookcase in the other room, because this behind me is one little tiny bit of a whole of probably 12 or 13 volumes of all the weekly emails I got from all sorts of rabbinic teaching. And so it made a big difference. And it was all from one little fax that my brother-in-law subscribed me to that I didn't even know about.
So I think it's so beautiful. So many of those lessons. One being that when parents are clear on what's important to them, it goes into the children even many years later. The second point that I took away from that's phenomenal is, I mean, I had this experience, which I don't know the proper forum for it, but I think it's so crucial. When I would run birthright trips, we would have the young soldiers that would join on, and they would always say, Rabbi, I'm not religious. And their definition of religious is kosher or, right. Exactly. Sabbath observant. But I said, excuse me, you are living in the land of Israel. You are be willing every day to lay down your life to save a random person you don't even know. It's like, at what point did I said, how do you know you're not more religious than I am? I wear a kippah, but and I think that the same thing's true is this concept that, a lot of people think, quote, religious is this, but if you look at what your life is and what you're doing, it's the really the passionate pursuit of helping other people be more successful and live better lives. And again, like you said with the book from Rabbi Pliskin, like that's a very, what does it mean that we're the light of the light to the nations? Like that's a big thing about what our, I guess our national product is helping people live better lives and more conscious lives. I think that's very important.
Yeah, and that's why, by the way, I distinguish between observant, which might mean certain things, and religious. And so I think you make a great point. It always goes back to defining terms, and it was another lesson I learned on. Rab Noach had a great, and again, I got the tape. That's how long ago this was. 48 Ways to Wisdom.
Right.
And one of the things he talked about is defining terms. And he tells this great story in a class where he says, how many of you would be offended if somebody you didn't know walked up to you and called you a buffoustic? And some people raised their hands, some people didn't, some people, I wouldn't want someone that, this and that. And they said to the rabbi, why? What would your reaction be? Or what would your response be? And the rabbi said, well, the first thing I do is I'd ask, what's a buffoustic? And so, so it's so important that we define our terms. And you're right. I often hear people saying I'm not religious when what they mean is I'm not observant of certain, laws, rituals, what have the mitzvot and so forth.
But we're always. But I'm saying that my point is that everyone's growing, and that they're
right.
I'm saying
right.
like it's such a crucial thing. Okay, I know that I've gone over my time. I have.
That's okay. That's okay. Rabbi can do that stuff. It's okay.
I know, right? I heard the definition of an optimist is someone that puts their shoes on when the rabbi says, "My last thought is." So I guess the last two questions, if I could, and maybe if there's a time to do a follow-up, that would be amazing. The first one is when you obviously your stature grows. Your book became a huge runaway bestseller. It was very fundamental in influencing the new generation of, like you talked about, influencers. Is there one thing that you found that really stood out, like a learning lesson that you had after you had written your book, that as you continue to develop, what's the new thing? What's the new concept that you might not have known when your book came out initially? Be it about personal stuff, about, the fact that you just naturally kind of go in the air of other people that are successful influencers, et cetera. What's something you learned that you didn't know previously?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Well, I'm always learning things that I didn't know. As far as general principles go of learning, I don't know that there's, anything new under the sun in terms of what what new, concept or something. As I continue to learn and study, and it's been, I think, 10, 11 years since the first book's out, I know so much more about certain things than I knew back then, because, hopefully my knowledge bank has always grown. Hopefully the wisdom bank is growing too, the knowledge I turn into wisdom. But so is there anything that I think is particularly new or different?
I'm just saying, it's interesting because, like you said, like a person has to be in a certain mindset, or maybe hearing it from a specific individual. So I'm just looking at, the back. It's so fun because I'm looking at, I guess there's a certain, like a sales Masorah, if you would, a transmission from, you go from the Tom Hopkins and the Zig Ziglars and people. I think Tom's still alive, I think, right?
Yeah.
But Zig Ziglar passed away. But then you're looking at, the people. I'm just like, look, they wrote the back of your book, the Ariana Huffingtons and the Daniel Pinks and the Glenn Becks and the Dave Ramseys, kind of like this new age of sales trainers. Has something, a specific person, spoken a lesson out that you're like, oh, now I get it, or is it really that it's just it's a process of just refining concepts?
Yeah, I think it's more the process of refining, though there's certain people that have really, like, for example, Harry Brown, a person who most people have not heard of, Brown, Browne, and he was an economist. He was also a great libertarian thinker. He was a great writer and a fantastic human being. I got to know him a little bit, and he wrote some things that really, he was a guy who really studied human nature, and he honored and respected human nature. He didn't try to change it, but rather he worked within it. And I think reading Harry gave me even more of a desire to even dig deeper into human nature than I had. And since doing that and reading so many of the books that I have regarding human nature, I think that's given me even more of an opportunity to to understand more, to learn more, to kind of get why some things happen, whereas before I may not have. So yeah, I would use Harry as an example of someone who provided information that, that really made a difference for me.
Amazing. Okay, so what's next? Last question. What's next for Bob Burg in terms of the message, the Go-Giver? Like, where are you seeing this revolution going?
Well, we continue to build our certified Go-Giver speakers program, where we have people who've been very successful in their business who license my materials, and we teach them how to be professional speakers, how to market themselves, how to teach the Go-Giver message. We have some of our Go-Giver Entrepreneur Academies that are 2.5 days. We limit those to 10 people because we get very, very deep into their business. And we'll be coming out with an online course called Endless Referrals, the Go-Giver Way. So we're excited about that. And we continue, to promote the books, because that's really kind of where it starts. And people come to the site and a relationship builds and things happen. So, we're still having fun with it.
Beautiful. Okay, Bob, how do people find out more about you personally or about the work that you're doing? You mentioned the site, but when people want to flock to your teachings, where do they go?
Best place is probably the book site, which is thegogiver without the hyphen.com, thegogiver.com.
Amazing. Bob Burg, thank you so much for the time.
There you have it, folks, another inspiring episode. If you enjoyed this, I ask you to please share this with your friends and to like us over on Rabbi Rupp through Facebook or on YouTube. And the more that we're able to get these important messages out, the more that we can really make an impact in the world. So I encourage you, please, to stay tuned. We have a ton of amazing speakers coming up, and also to tell your friends about it. Thank you very much.